Hi students. So this is our next lecture, Basic Biology of a Plant. We all know what plants are, right? They are beautiful, they are green, some of them have flowers, etc. And we certainly know that they produce the uh, much needed oxygen and consume much unneeded harmful carbon dioxide. Now let's try to take a look at what plants are and how is their biology, their anatomy, their structure, etc., corresponds with the history of life on Earth. Actually, the plants were, as this slide shows, they are thought to have evolved from green algae, and they are the first organisms to colonize land. And so algae, remember, they belong to the kingdom Protista or protists, and they live in water, right? So they are aquatic organisms, and plants are terrestrial organisms. They live on solid support, on the soil. Uh, the plants evolved, developed multicellularity. Plants are multicellular, differentiated tissues. We will take a more detailed look at that later. And special adaptations allowing them to withstand gravity. See, this is an important adaptation because equestrial uh, sorry, organisms that live in water uh, don't need that. They are just buoying, right? Or they anchor to the bottom of a body of water, but the water actually suspends them, right? They don't need to fight with gravity. On the other hand, if a plant grows on Earth, on the soil, and there's no water surrounding it to make it buoy, to protect it from gravity. It must have something in it that does not allow it just to bend and fall down. Uh, what this is rigidity. Certain substances add rigidity. Certain organelles in plant cells help to these cells to be more rigid and withstand gravity. And you see here a slide showing a charophyte. It's a fossil. Actually, these organisms do not exist anymore on Earth. And evolution biologists, paleontologists think that charophytes they were still algae. They still are not really plants, but they are like a link between algae and plants. They develop adaptations to live on dry land. Now let's go from bottom to top as far as organization of a plant goes. This is a plant cell, and I don't know how much you were lectured on plant cells in Biology 101. Uh, as far as I remember teaching Biology 1, the lectures about cells, they were focusing more on the so-called typical cell. Actually, it was an animal cell. But plant cells have some specific peculiar features. First of all, just as we discussed previously, the plant cells have something in them that gives them rigidity. And rigidity helps the plant to withstand gravity. What are these adaptations for rigidity? First of all, you see some huge reservoir of liquid in the center of the cell. It's the so-called central vacuole. It's like a balloon filled with some liquid. It's difficult to squeeze, right? Uh, Liquids are impossible to compress. Gases are possible to compress, but liquids not. And this central vacuole is something that gives rigidity to the whole structure of the plant cell. Then, if you look at the cellular membrane, you see there is something outside of the cellular membrane, which is called cell wall. Right? Cell wall. Cell wall is basically in plants it's made of cellulose, mostly cellulose. Polysaccharides, well, linear polysaccharide, huge molecules of repeats of monosaccharides. It is very rigid by itself, and it gives rigidity to the cell. Then there are adaptations for photosynthesis. Algae already have pigments that allow them to perform photosynthesis. In plants, this ability to perform photosynthesis further develops. You see these long green organelles, yellow organelles are mitochondria, and green organelles with some grain inside them. They are chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have internal membranes kind of similar to mitochondrial crystal. These internal membranes in chloroplasts are called thylakoid membranes. On some electron microscopy preparations, you can see that a thylakoid membrane is kind of like a stack of coins that are put one on top of the other. And these coins contain the important photosynthesizing pigment chlorophyll, which has green color. Then also in the chloroplasts, you see there's an arrow pointing at starch grains. So the thylakoid granules contain, or thylakoid membranes rather, contain chlorophyll and perform the so-called light reactions of photosynthesis. But then in the soup of the cytoplasm of the chloroplast, matrix, that's the proper term, matrix of the chloroplast, there are grains of starch. It means that in the matrix, there is no more photosynthesis per se, but there is this usage of the energy accumulated during photosynthesis, which is harnessed to produce large organic molecules. I mean, it's so-called dark reactions or Calvin-Benson cycle, during which glucose and then starch are formed. It's a unique feature of autotrophic cells, algae, and also plant cells. Then this picture does not show you that, but if you look at the cell wall and then upper right corner, cell wall and wall of an adjoining cell. You see, there is like a little hole in the cell wall of the cells to the left from the arrow that says cell wall. And there is a channel kind of leading to the neighboring cell. This structure is called plasmodesma, singular, or plasmodesmata, plural. So basically this kind of like button, right, which can be unbuttoned, and then there is communication between two cells, and they freely exchange their cytoplasm and gases, etc. So the plant may live as a community of communicating, talking to each other plant cells. Okay. Then going up, plant tissues. If you remember from the from Biology 101, you were explained what tissues are. Tissues are groups of cells that specialize in performing certain functions. Like in animal cells, there's an epithelial tissue which forms covers, and there is a connective tissue, there's muscular tissue and nervous tissue. In plants, there are three major types of tissues. There is dermal tissue. It's analog of the epithelial cells, epithelial tissue in the animal cells. Dermal tissue covers. Then there is ground tissue, sort of like an equivalent of connective tissue in animal cells. And then there is vascular tissue. It's a very specialized tissue. It is not present in all plants. There is a group called avascular plants. They don't have this vascular tissue, but in all other plants there is this vascular tissue. And let's take a closer look at what that is. Vascular tissue is actually a collection of long vertical tubes. There are two kinds of them inside in the internal circle. There are two kinds of tubes. They have Latin names. One type is called xyleme and the other phloeme. Xyleme is a system of tubes that transport water and minerals from the roots to the shoots, so upward against the forces of gravity. And so there are some osmotic, mostly mechanisms that sort of drag the water and minerals upwards. And xylem is the subtype of the plant vascular tissue that is responsible for that. And phloeme is also a system of vertical tubes that transport sugars, glucose, fructose, galactose, starch, and other carbohydrates, from where they are made or stored to other parts of the plant. Where are sugars made? Mostly in the leaves, right? As the result of the Calvin-Benson cycle, like the continuation of photosynthesis. And other sugars like starch it is produced in the leaf as the result of photosynthesis and then transported to the root, so downwards from the leaf to the root, and it is stored in the root. So xyleme transports waters and minerals mostly vertically against the force of gravity, and phloeme can transport sugars in both directions, vertically and upwards and downwards. Okay, plant organs. So organs, in all plants there is this division between the underground organs called roots. See, there is at the bottom of this slide, there is a root system. And the superficial part of the plant, which is visible, it rises above the ground. It is called shoot. So the root system is under the soil, and shoot system is above the soil. In the shoot, we have the stem, right? It's the usually vertically positioned, rigid tube part of plant. That is the place where the vascular tissue is very well represented in vascular plants, and you see both phloeme and xylem there. Then there are leaves, and each leaf has a blade, a petiole, a little foot that supports it, and auxiliary bud. Bud is that's the part of the stem from where the leaf grows. And there are flowers, not in all plants. There are flowering plants called angiosperms, and there are many plants who have no flowers. But on this particular plant, flower is shown, so it's an angiosperm. The flower is a reproductive organ. Well, the root is basically the feeding and the storage, feeding of the entire plant by absorbing water, absorbing minerals, absorbing some nutrients, if the soil is fertilized, and it stores nutrients. It stores predominantly starch. Stem is a vertical part of the plant which sort of it is responsible to the largest extent to fight gravity for the plant to stand. Leaves are organs of photosynthesis. Basically, in most plants, almost entire photosynthesis, almost 100% of photosynthetic synthetic reactions occur in the leaves. And flower is a reproductive organ. In what way? Plants reproduce sexually. And so they have sperm cells and egg cells. They have male gametes and female gametes. We will talk a bit more about it in next slides. And most plants are what we call hermaphrodites. They have male sexual cells and female sexual cells in one organism. Both of these types of cells are located in the plant, in the flower, in flowering plants. So it's a reproductive organ where the male and female sexual cells meet, fuse, right, and form the progeny, the child plant, or baby plant, daughter plant, son plant. Next, let's go to this slide, and it kind of elaborates on reproduction of plants. Plants reproduce sexually. Recall that first organisms that can reproduce sexually are fungi. Remember, we saw a picture where there are two hyphae of two neighboring fungi, and they can fuse together, and their cells also fuse. If in each cell of one individual hyphae the number of chromosomes is n, then in the fused cell this number is 2n. So the first the cells in the hypha before the fusion, we call them haploid. And the cells after fusion, 2n, doubled number of chromosomes, so we call them diploid. And some of these diploid cells undergo meiosis. Again, the result of meiosis, as you remember from Bio1, is formation of haploid gamete cells. In fungi, the haploid cells of any two parental organisms are not differentiated into male and female cells. So there's no such thing as a Mr. Fungus or a Mrs. Fungus. Each hypha has a certain number of haploid cells, and that's the only difference between it and the diploid part of the fungus. But on the other hand, in plants, and of course in animals, there are male haploid cells, sperm, and female haploid cells, eggs or ova. Haploid cells are called gametes. Remember, this is an important term. So plants have male gametes, sperm, and female gametes, eggs or ova. And you might recall from Biology 101, when two gametes of the opposing sexes fuse together, how do we call the resulting cell? Zygote. Zygotes are diploid. They divide mitotically, producing actually all organs of the animal and human organisms, but some of them undergo meiosis, become sexual cells, gametes, and participate in further reproduction. And always remember, when we talk about meiosis, I always want you to remember this one very important, fundamental fact about meiosis. Meiosis is a generator of genetic diversity. Asexual reproduction produces clones, cells that are pretty much Xerox copies of each other, while meiosis is uh, it is accompanied by the independent assortment of paternal and maternal chromosomes, and this large number of combinations of paternal and maternal chromosomes gives diversity to the next generation. Plants are not exactly clones. Animals are not naturally clones of each other. Humans are definitely not clones of each other. Okay, now let's move on. We have another lecture. The previous lecture was pretty short, so I decided to put this next lecture, lecture 6, into the same series of slides. Evolution and diversity of plants. Uh, let's first look at this table with text. Evolutionary history of plants. To conserve water, the land plant body is covered by a waxy cuticle. Right? That's an important step in the evolution. Then vascular cell transports water and minerals and sugars in the body of the land plant. Uh, that's an innovation. There is no vascular system in an algae or other protists. It appears in plants. Now, it is thought that plants have evolved from freshwater green algae over 450 millions of years ago. So relatively recently, you see, when recall when did protists evolve or appear? 2 point something billion years ago, and first plants are thought, based on the fossil record and radiometric method, they are thought to have appeared about 450 million years ago. And then evolution of plants is marked by 4 evolutionary events associated with 4 major groups of plants. And so here are these 4 groups of plants shown on the left in the picture. The first to the left, most primitive and probably most ancient group of plants were non-vascular plants. So they have they had and still have adaptation number 1, the waxy cuticle, but they do not have the transport system, right? And they also do not have seeds, they do not have flowers, etc. But they reproduce sexually. Then the rest of the plants are vascular plants, and in turn these vascular plants, which have phloem and xylem, they are subdivided into 3 groups. Seedless vascular plants. What do you think is shown on the picture on top of this seedless vascular plants branch? A fern, right? They are seedless vascular plants. So they have xylem and phloem, but they do not make seeds. And then there are 2 groups of plants that are vascular and make seeds. The first is called gymnosperms. You see a pine or fir tree and a cone. That's cones are like paramount characteristic of gymnosperm. And angiosperm. Angiosperms are flowering plants. So all the trees and bushes with beautiful flowers that you see around you appearing in spring and then blossoming and throughout the warm part of the year, they are angiosperms, or vascular plants that make seeds and have flowers. Pine trees, fir trees, cypress trees are gymnosperms. They have seeds, but they do not have flowers. So that's the difference. Okay, and next, let's look at the most ancient, the most primitive group of plants beginning from liverworts. Liverworts are typical avascular plants. Right? They do not have a system of transportation. Right? They belong to the group called bryophytes. We will look at some other bryophytes in a second. And they reproduce sexually, but their sexual cells, gametes, need to swim to each other to fuse to be fertilized. So they are thought to be the first type of plants that kind of made this leap from water to dry land, but they still retain features of algae, of water organisms. Their gametes have to swim. Then non-vascular plants, mosses. Mosses are a huge group. They are plants. They also belong to the group of bryophytes, common on humidified soil, rocks, and trees. Just like liverworts, they reproduce sexually, and fertilization occurs only in water. And in this group of plants, there is an interesting thing. You see moss, right? It's like a mat of something green and soft, etc., etc. And you know what? The mat is actually a gametophyte. It's a collection of cells that are all haploid, right? So they're all like gametes, reproductive cells, but they divide mitotically, right? This mat can grow by asexual reproduction of sexual haploid cells. This does not, it's a feature only of the plants. In animals, you cannot even imagine, or in humans, that, for example, a sperm cell would suddenly replicate a million times and grow into something macroscopic that we see without the microscope. This simply does not happen, right? But in plants, it happens. Like in mosses, this entire mat it consists of blades, and each blade is actually a colony or collection of cells that are all haploid. Then if you look closely, within this mat, there are stalks. So the stems that are not green, usually yellow color or gray color, and they have some like little head on top. These stalks with little head are called sporophytes. So a stalk is a sporophyte, and it has diploid cells. These diploid cells, they are the result of fusion of diploid cells of the mat, right? And these diploid cells can be from versus these haploid cells that are being fused, they can be from the same blade or from neighboring blades, and and they can be from two organisms that are genetically different. Right? So when after fusion these newly formed diploid cells undergo meiosis and become spores, again they have these independently assorted chromosomes in each gamete, one from one parent and the other from the other parent moss. And this introduces this huge genetic diversity and protects mosses from some catastrophes. If there is an infectious disease and all organisms in this moss are clones, right? They will all succumb. But if they are genetically different, there is a possibility that some of them, because of new genomic features, will be resistant to this infection and survive. Right? Hornworts also a kind of bryophytes. They are interesting visually, but nothing really outstanding about them in terms of biology. Uh, then, and this shows you in some more detail what happens during reproduction of non-vascular plants. See, on top of the circle, right, there is this is a multicellular haploid organism. It's the blade of the mat in mosses, right? And it's a gametophyte, meaning that all cells in it are haploid, kind of like gametes. Then these haploid cells undergo mitosis and the blades grow. That's something that is never happening in animals, only in plants. Then the mitosis produces enough cells so that these cells can, some of these cells, which there all are gametes, right? But some of them will remain in the growing blade, and some of them will fall down and fuse with other gametes, also haploid cells of another moss. Right? So the fertilization will occur, and the resulting zygote will be diploid. And this diploid zygote will reproduce mitotically, produce the multicellular diploid organism. That's the stalks that we talked about, the sporophytes. And then in the sporophyte, there is meiosis, right? And the resulting haploid gametes are basically, they are new mosses, and they form these new blades of moss, again divide mitotically, and then the cycle repeats. And I will not quiz you exactly on this video, but my dog is whining. Uh, I just recommend you this video. I will not quiz you on it, but it may explain things to you very well. Right, then seedless vascular plants, like ferns. Like they have phloem and xylem, but they do not have, they don't form seeds. Very similar, actually, to what happens in bryophytes like moss, except what you see in this large growing beautiful ferns, right? They consist of diploid cells, and but cells that are being specialized for meiosis and for forming spores. They grow only on the leaf underside, and the parts of the leaf underside where there are groups of these meiosis undergoing cells are small. Right? So remember, in mosses, a huge part of the moss is haploid, what we see, this green mat, it's entirely diploid, and small parts, these stalks, are sporophytes, they are diploid. In ferns, it's the other way around. Actually, the organism is diploid, and some cells of it specialize in meiosis, and you see in the upper part of this drawing, they, after undergoing meiosis, they form spores, and then these spores reach another fern where they fuse with the gametes of that fern, the egg cells or ova, right? And you see the egg cell which begins to divide mitotically, forming the next generation of fern. And again, see this, fertilization occurs only when spores fall in water. And so ferns principally cannot grow in desert, right, in the sand. They do require water, not just for metabolism, right, because there are plants that live in sub-Saharan Africa or even in Sahara Desert, they have an elaborate root system, so they find some water, draw some water in. But in ferns, just like in mosses, by the way, too, the fertilization must occur in water. So there must be a very humid part of the soil where the gametes can literally swim toward each other, especially sperm cells. They must swim toward the egg cell of another plant, another fern. Okay, next is a more complicated group of seed plants, gymnosperms. Beautiful pine tree forest, a cone, which is like a paramount feature of gymnosperms, and a different kind of cone, also cone, but not like this. So, gymnosperms, right away, they have two kinds of cones, uh, one producing female gametes and the other producing male gametes. Uh, this is a little bit complicated slide showing details of reproduction of gymnosperms, and I do not insist that you memorize all the terms that are on the slide, but I want you just to understand the principle. How gymnosperms like pines, fir trees, cypress trees, how do they reproduce? They make two kinds of cones. One of them, which usually we associate this cone with a pine tree, it's called ovulate cone. The ovulate cones, they have this rigid sort of tile structure, and if you lift an element of this tile structure, you can see an ovule. An ovule. It's the part of the uh, uh, of the pine tree or fir tree, etc., where diploid cells are being specialized to perform meiosis. And then when they do perform meiosis, then they form the egg cells. When egg cells are fertilized by sperm cells, again the diploid cell appears and it replicates, producing a next generation of the gymnosperm. Now, and what about the other type of cone is called pollen cone. And pollen cone produces pollen grains. And, what you have on your windshield of your car in Mississippi, beginning from like mid-May until maybe early July, there's this massive falling of the pollen from pine trees. Pollen is the product of pollination, which is actually meiosis. But while the meiosis of cells in the ovule produces egg cell, right, the meiosis in the pollen cone produces these sporophylls and then individual grains of pollen. They are like sperm, right? So you can view a fir tree or a pine tree or a cypress as a hermaphrodite, organism that has male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs in the same organism. A male reproductive organ is the pollen cone, and female reproductive organ is an ovulate cone. Pollen cone produces grains of pollen, which are like sperm, and ovulate cone produces an egg cell or ovum, which is like egg cell in higher organisms, in animals and humans, etc. Right. Then, when these newly formed, or when these gametes, male and female gametes, form in cones, what happens? The Sporophylls, where egg cells are produced by meiosis, they just remain on the uh, on the cone. They don't go anywhere. They don't migrate. But in the ovule cone, after these pollen grains are produced, they are spread pretty much in all directions by wind, right? And they can fall on an egg cell of a pine tree, which is way far from the origin, from the tree that did produce these pollen grains. So and pollen of the uh, gymnosperms from fir trees, pines, etc., does not have pollen. A pollen grain does not have to swim. It is moved by air, by winds. Uh, then why gymnosperms? Gymnosperms, the uh, uh, part of the word gymno always it comes from the Greek root gymnos, which means naked, right? So these the gametes of these trees, of these plants, are not uh, protected by something like a flower, and the zygote is not protected by something like a fruit or something, or an apple or pear, etc. So they are like naked gametes, and that's a disadvantage. So the next step in evolution was forming plants that can protect their gametes and their zygotes, growing something around them. So I think this is just a quick classification of gymnosperms. There are conifers, there are cycads, which are not really characteristic here. Then there is ginkgos, ginkgo tree. You know, on MUW campus, there's an alley that is called Ginkgo Alley, and they are really beautiful, especially in fall when their leaves become golden yellow, very bright. And that's actually not leaves. They look like leaves, but they're not really leaves. They're more like eagle or how do you call it? The uh, sharp parts of the uh, pine tree that grows from the small branches of the pine tree. But in ginkgos, they are broader, they're not sharp, and they turn really yellow in fall. And there are also gnetophytes or netophytes. They are very rare, and there are no netophytes around us. So just basically remember conifers and ginkgos. Um, then uh, angiosperms, definition of angiosperm, flowering plants. They are most abundant of plants. They reproduce by seeds or pollination, and they contain fruit. That's why that's basically how they differ from gymnosperms. Fruit is the place where the zygote is, and it is protected by this thick layer of tissue made mostly of carbohydrate, water, and some minerals and vitamins, and very often very tasty. People eat it, etc. Okay, so the small gallery of angiosperms. You see the roses, the tulips, the lilies, sunflowers. I don't know what this tree is, but I think it's one of my pictures that I took on campus several years ago when there was a golden fall. So they are flowering plants. They produce flower and then some kind of fruit, then uh, anatomy of a flower. That's an important part that you need to know and understand. Uh, there is a male and a female part of flower. Like, petals are not male and not female. They are um, regular diploid cells which produce aromatic substances mostly to attract uh, insects, which serve as uh, pollinators. Well, in gymnosperms, the wind carries the pollen, but in flowering plants, in angiosperms, it also can be wind, but it can be a bee or a wasp, or usually bees are the best pollinators. Then there is a female part of the flower, which actually produces where female gametes are developed. It's called the carpel. Upper right corner shows you the stigma, the upper part of the carpel, the style, the middle part, and the ovary. Ovary that's where ovule are. Remember, in uh, gymnosperms there are also ovules, but they are on the ovulating, or on the female cones, right, on the inside. And in flowering plants, they are in a special sac called receptacle. Now, in order to fertilize this, in the ovule, meiosis produces ova or eggs. To fertilize this egg, a grain of pollen must come into the stigma and travel down to the receptacle. Uh, very rather often, flowering plants pollinate themselves, so and fertilize themselves. So the pollen is male gametes. They penetrate into the stigma of the carpel of the same plant. Or it may be a different pollen brought from another plant, usually by an insect, often by honeybees. So the botanists use terms like self-pollination or cross-pollination. Then the uh, other part of the flower, the male part of the flower, upper left corner. It says stamen. Stamen is the male part. It develops pollen, so there are diploid cells there that undergo meiosis and become specialized as pollen grains. They are in the they are accumulating in the upper part of the stamen called anther. So from anther, the sperm or pollen grains have to travel to the carpel, enter through the stigma, go down the style, and reach the ovary and fertilize the egg cell. That's how flowers reproduce. This is another sort of depiction of what happens during reproduction of angiosperms. And what is interesting in this, um, in this picture, the previous picture showed you just basically organs of the plant, flowering plant. But here you see what happens after fertilization. In the right part of this circle, you see zygote, right? That's the product of fertilization. It's a diploid cell, right, which carries a certain number of chromosomes from the male part of this same or another plant, and an equal number of chromosomes from the ovule, from the female part of the plant. They fuse and produce these cells, gametes having these chromosomes fuse and form diploid uh, zygote, which then undergoes meiosis and, or some cells of the zygote undergo meiosis and form, uh, uh, wait, yeah, and form gametes. But uh, the at first the zygote must uh, grow. So the cells of the diploid cells of the zygote reproduce mitotically. And in the a little bit left and down from the picture of the zygote, there is a picture of embryo or sporophyte. It's the zygote which has mitotically reproduced like many thousand times. Because you see here there are layers of cells, and so apparently that is quite a bit of time after the zygote was fertilized. Then what happens, and this is also interesting on this on this picture, the zygote becomes surrounded by fruit. The zygote becomes seed, right? And the seed is surrounded by fruit. The fruit tissues grow from a special part of the embryo, which uh, basically it loses its cellular structure but becomes this mass of mostly carbohydrates and water, minerals, and vitamins. And it's a mechanical protection for the zygote. The zygote becomes seed, right? What you see, these seed grains inside the apple, that's actually zygotes that are protected by the soft part, many layers of these soft material from originating from special part of the embryo. Then the seed is let go. Right? Naturally, if people don't harvest apples or pears, etc., the fruit kind of degrades during the colder part of the year, and the seeds are uh, simply falling on the ground. Then these seeds are germinating, right? So they're dividing mitotically, plus some of their cells are specializing into uh, future gametes. So the flowering plant grows, it is diploid, it is from the diploid seed. But some parts of it have cells that undergo meiosis, become either pollen grains or egg cells in the female part of the next generation of the plant. All right. Now, a little bit about the fruit. Again, fruit is a major system of protection of the newly formed zygote. Uh, and there, you see on this picture there are several stages of the growth of the fruit, and eventually you see the uh, uh, antipodal cells that are responsible for making the matrix, the protective layers, etc. And you see a zygote inside with polar nuclei. It's not yet a zygote. It is kind of like synkaryon. It's the stage in the life of the cell when the two cells fused, but their nuclei did not fuse. And these nuclei remain sperm nuclei and egg nuclei, right? So when this zygote undergoes meiosis within this embryo sac, uh, eggs and pollen grains can form. That's about it. So, my advice is read chapter 9, the parts that are about plants, and also read the previous lecture, including the part on fungi, and prepare for your coming soon first midterm exam, which will be closed book exam. You will be given a certain time and your work will be proctored. So please catch up if you have some gaps in your knowledge about the origin of life, the generation of the diversity in life, domains, kingdoms, protozoans, etc. Catch up with this and also read everything about the generation of diversity in eukaryotes, except animals. Material about animals is in the chapter 10, and it will be after your midterm. I believe, I have to look again in the syllabus, but I believe that it will be after your first midterm exam, so don't worry about it right now. The exam will be mostly on chapter 8, but you will have to be able to operate with some material from chapter 9. Right? Like I will not ask you on the exam what's the difference between stamen and carpel and etc. Some details of the anatomy of the plant, or I will not ask you to name all the groups and subgroups of plants, but you must be uh, trained in the usage of terms like haploid, diploid, uh, gametes, zygotes. Those are basic biology terms that you will need to use. Maybe some exam questions will in some form contain these. Okay, thank you so much for listening and best of luck.